Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for IBAC's Perceptions of Corruption webinar. I'm Linda Timothy, Executive Director, Prevention and Communication at IBAC. And I'm really pleased to be facilitating today's webinar and to be able to share with you the insights and findings from our Perceptions of Corruption survey. To begin today, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians of the land that we are broadcasting from. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay respect to their elders past and present and to any Aboriginal people joining us today. I also respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways across Victoria and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. So it's fantastic that so many of you could join us today. We had over 400 people registered to join the webinar today, with representatives from right across Victoria and further afield. I would also like to welcome our partner agencies within the Victorian integrity system, as well as those joining us from interstate. Today's webinar is an opportunity to share the results and insights from the Perceptions of Corruption surveys that IBAC undertook in 2022. And we hope that you'll be able to make use of those insights and what it all means for you in your own workplaces. Today, we're joined by 3 speakers who will outline the survey results and share their insights from this work. Our speakers today are all from IBAC, and they are Dr. Karen Adams, Strategic Advisor, Prevention and Communication, David Wolfe, Deputy Commissioner, and Kylie Kilgar, Deputy Commissioner. Thanks to you all for taking the time to be with us here today. But just before I hand over to our first speaker, a few housekeeping things. If you would like to turn on live captions, you can do so by clicking on Closed Captions in the meeting controls at the bottom of your desktop. Or if you're using a mobile device, by clicking on Settings in the Zoom app and then tapping Meeting to turn on the closed captions. And if you experience any technical difficulties, please check that you've first downloaded the latest version of Zoom. So there will be an opportunity to ask questions in an audience Q&A session in the second half of this webinar. So I would encourage you all to submit any comments and questions you have throughout today's event by using the Q&A function, which you'll also see on the bottom of your screen. And please be aware that we're not able to answer questions about ongoing investigations. The webinar will last for approximately 1 hour. We will continue the conversation after the event by sending you links to any resources that are mentioned today and answering questions we're not able to get to. And lastly, a recording of the webinar will be made available on the IBAC website in the coming weeks, and we'll also share the presentation slides. So now I am delighted to introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Karen Adams. Karen led the 2022 Perceptions of Corruption Survey Research Project. The project is one of a number of key initiatives delivered under IBAC's Corruption Prevention Strategy, 2021 to 24. So Karen will introduce the research and cover some of the key themes from the 2022 survey. Please welcome Karen.
Thanks very much, Linda. So just by way of background to start, perceptions of corruption surveys have been undertaken by IBAC in previous years. So in 2013, 2015, 16 and 2019. The surveys have been conducted across multiple sectors and audiences. So this includes with Victorian public service employees, local government employees, Victoria Police employees, business suppliers, as well as members of the Victorian community. So the surveys largely reflect the jurisdiction that IBAC oversights when it comes to corruption and police misconduct. So just by way of reminder, IBAC's jurisdiction extends across the whole of the Victorian public sector. So this includes members of parliament, the judiciary, police, as well as state and local government. And this adds up to over 400,000 public sector employees in around 3,500 organisations. So about the project, so the overarching objective of our perceptions research is really to understand perceptions of corruption in the public sector and police misconduct amongst those different target audiences. So specifically, the research explored awareness and perceptions about IBAC, perceived prevalence of public sector corruption and police misconduct, levels of understanding about the types of behaviours that are considered to be corrupt or misconduct, as well as the likelihood to report corruption or misconduct if observed and to who. One of the key changes from last year or for last year was that this was the first time that we've undertaken all of these surveys at the same time, which enabled us to make comparisons across groups and look at trends over time. So what it involved was a 10-minute online survey, which was conducted in May. And for Victoria Police, the survey was undertaken in August. We sought assistance from appropriate groups to promote the survey and distribute the survey link within the different employee and supplier cohorts. So we spoke to 5 different stakeholder groups and they were invited to participate. So what that covered was 3,000 Victorians aged 18 years and over. We had 1,430 Victorian government business suppliers, almost 2,500 local government employees, just under 4,500 public sector employees, and 1,000 Victoria Police employees. So all up over 12,000 participants. The surveys were voluntary, so no specific details about participants or their workplace were recorded, and this was to protect anonymity of the participants. So for this reason, it's not possible to provide findings for any individual agency. However, we did ask what sector participants worked within, so that allows us to provide some findings at a sector level, which we'll talk about a little bit today. So this leads me on to my first topic of discussion, which is knowledge about corruption. So firstly, a good news story. Close to 9 in 10 government employees and suppliers agreed that they know what behaviour constitutes corruption. This dropped to about 7 in 10 amongst the general community. Across all groups, though, we were seeing significantly more people say that they know what behaviour constitutes corruption compared to when we last measured that in 2016. So let's move on to look at perceptions of corruption. The survey demonstrated to us that perceptions that corruption or police misconduct are happening in Victoria have increased significantly since 2016. This was also the case when we asked about perceptions of whether corruption or police misconduct was a problem. So more than 80% of participants across all of the survey groups agreed that corruption or police misconduct happens, compared to about 60% who reported this to be the case in 2016. Those working in local government were most likely to agree that corruption happens, followed closely by those employed in the public sector, as well as suppliers who are contracting for state or local government. One potential observation could be whether the increased number of participants who said that they know what behaviour constitutes corruption has had a flow-on impact to those respondents then having greater awareness and recognition in seeing this happen in the workplace or in the community, and hence an increased percentage reporting that they think corruption and police misconduct is happening in 2022 compared to back in 2016. Probably one other thing that's important to acknowledge is the timing of the 2022 surveys. So these occurred around a time when IBAC had several major operations which were being widely reported in the media. So this may have influenced perceptions. The next slide examines whether people are likely to report corruption. So most of the local government, Victorian public sector and Victoria Police employees agreed that they would definitely report corruption or misconduct if they saw it. So upwards of 80%. The proportion who would definitely report corruption, though, is lowest amongst the community at around 76%. Positive news story was a consistent finding across all of the surveys that people were more likely to report corruption or misconduct in 2022 compared to 2016, although that change was minimal when we looked at community members. So this leads me on to my final discussion point for today, which is, do people think a report of corruption will be taken seriously? While more people told us that they would report corruption or misconduct if they saw it, the views really differed by group about whether a report of corruption would be taken seriously. So nearly half of local government employees felt definite that a report of corruption would be taken seriously. That compares to around 35% for Victorian public sector employees and drops back a little bit to 29% for Victoria police employees. And what we saw is across local government and the public sector is that this has decreased over time. So I'll leave it to our next two presenters to delve into these findings in more detail for each of the respective survey groups and to identify some of the opportunities to address these different key themes. But hopefully this brief introduction has helped to provide an overview of some of these emerging themes and trends, as well as some of the similarities and differences when it comes to perceptions about corruption and police misconduct.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you. Some really important context around reporting corruption and misconduct. So thank you. So just a reminder, we're seeing some questions coming in. So please remember to keep submitting any questions you have for our speakers. We'll get to them after our next presentations. So I'd now like to introduce David Wolfe, Deputy Commissioner at IBAC. David joined IBAC in January 2020 as Deputy Commissioner and brings wide-ranging expertise drawn from a career in the public sector and policing. David was formerly Victoria's Chief Municipal Inspector and Head of the Local Government Inspectorate. At IBAC, David's focus is on both the public sector and local government. Today, David will cover the key findings from employees in the Victorian public sector, local government, and Victorian government business suppliers. Please welcome David.
Thanks, Linda, and hello to everyone. I've got quite a lot of information to get through. So I want to start by looking at the VPS Employee Perception of Corruption Survey. And as was mentioned earlier by Karen, we had nearly 4,500 Victorian public sector employees participate in the survey. And those participants were invited from state government departments as well as other major public sector agencies. And I'll start by giving some context about the respondents, which I think adds weight to the results. So about 25% of the VPS respondents had worked in the public sector for less than 5 years, and a similar number had worked for more than 20 years. So the bulk of the respondents for that 5 to 20 year experience, so a really experienced cohort. And over 1/3 of the respondents identified themselves as working in managerial roles. And for note, the top 5 sectors for respondents were the health, resource management, transport, education, and human services sectors. Now, to the survey results, and most VPS employees agree that they know what behaviour constitutes corruption. This result is higher compared to the findings from the 2016 survey and is a really positive outcome. More respondents perceive corruption to be a problem in Victoria, but not necessarily in their workplace. So in this survey, 61% of employees agree that corruption is a problem in Victoria, compared to 37% in 2016, so quite a significant increase. But importantly though, only 20% agree that it's a problem in their actual workplace. And the exception here is in the emergency services area, where 47% agree that corruption is a problem, and in the transport sector, where 34% identify this as an issue. So quite significantly different in terms of those areas. The key actions where corruption was seen as a risk were identified as conflicts of interest in decision-making, deliberate privacy breaches, and procurement activity. So what is clear for all sectors, but particularly the emergency services and transport areas, is what your staff are identifying as risk activities. So we also asked a series of questions of VPS employees to gauge attitudes towards reporting corruption or misconduct. And compared to 2016, there's an increased intent to report misconduct or corruption if it's personally observed. So we had 83% agree they would do so in 2022 compared to 72% in 2016, which is another really positive change. Employees were also more likely to feel that their direct supervisor would be supportive if they chose to make that report. And this is reflected in the finding that the first port of call for reporting corruption is most likely to be an immediate manager. However, there are a couple of concerning findings related to the reporting of corruption and misconduct. And the first being that less than 2/3 of employees reported that they knew how to make a report of corruption and misconduct. And secondly, there's been a significant increase in employees who indicated that they'd only report corruption if the report remained anonymous. Another very interesting result was employees in health and emergency services are significantly less likely to agree they would report corruption or misconduct. And what's interesting about this is that it's employees from these sectors that responded that corruption is significantly more a problem in their organisation, but they're less likely to report it. Now, if we move to local government perceptions of corruption, and it's from this sector, we had almost 2,500 local government employees participate in the survey. And respondents were from right across the state, roughly 50% in metropolitan and regional councils each. And about 2/3 of the respondents had worked in the sector for more than 5 years. So again, a high response rate from experienced employees. In the top 3 areas within the councils that participants identified as working within were community services, depot operations, and civic development. So like Victorian public sector employees, most local government employees believe that they know what constitutes corruption. This result is higher compared to the findings from the 2016 survey, and it's an excellent outcome reflecting the work local governments are doing to promote integrity in their workplace. Consistent with the other surveys, more local government employees perceive corruption to be a problem in Victoria, but not necessarily in their workplace. And you can see on the screen that only 17% of employees agree that corruption is a problem in their actual workplace. However, this has increased from 12% in the 2016 survey. Employees working in depot operations, for example, waste management, maintenance and engineering, were more likely to perceive corruption to be a problem in their own workplace. And there are similarities with this result to the VPS survey, where emergency services, transport and some of the health sector that have remote workplaces and varying degrees of oversight mechanisms, again, had a greater perception of corruption in their own individual workplace. Not surprisingly, procurement and favouritism in recruitment and promotion were the areas where corruption risk was identified to be the highest. One key issue that was raised was the acceptance of benefits or gifts from suppliers worth over the $50 threshold. 2/3 of managers who responded considered that gifts and benefits when interacting with the private sector is a current corruption risk. So this leads to our next topic of discussion, which is local government's views on ethical culture and reporting. So we asked a series of questions to gauge attitudes towards reporting of corruption or misconduct. And similar to the VPS employees, there is an increased intent to report misconduct or corruption if it's personally observed. So we had 86% agree that they would do so in 2022, compared to 75% in 2016. And again, we had 80% feel their direct supervisors would be supportive if they chose to make a report. A slightly greater proportion of local government employees reported that they knew how to make a report of corruption or misconduct. However, a similar trend that there has been an increase in employees who indicated they would only report corruption if the report remained anonymous. So with those survey results in mind, what can the VPS and local government do in this space? And it's important to note that those remote work sites continue to remain as a problem. So for emergency services, transport, health, and particularly local government and the depot operations, that ought to be a focus. The risk activities around conflict of interest, bribery, fraud, procurement, and those recruitment functions continue to remain prevalent in this survey. Importantly, having managers with the skills and capabilities to deal with a report of corruption is incredibly important, and having those skills in advance of that report being made. And to the extent possible, when organisations are dealing with a report of corruption or impropriety, it's important that they can be as transparent as possible to ensure there's confidence across the organisation that's being handled well. The last 2 dot points, I think for me, are the most important, and that goes to the heart of the culture of VPS and local government. And it's so important that management and senior management model ethical behaviours, and that there's a very clear and effective speak-up culture within the organisation, and staff have confidence when they speak up. Now, I want to move to the final part of the survey that interested me, and that was around the survey that sought responses from suppliers to government to understand where corruption risks might exist from their perspective. So over 1,400 government business suppliers participated in the survey, and to be eligible, the suppliers had to either have tendered or quoted for work within the Victorian public sector or local government, or won a contract to do work in either sector. And generally, there were good levels of awareness about what corruption is, with 93% of suppliers agreeing they know what constitutes corruption. There has been a significant increase in those who consider corruption to be a problem in 2022, with 82% in this survey compared with 64% in 2016. And as Karen pointed out, this may have been driven by some of the high-profile cases IBAC has exposed, particularly Operation Esperance. And while 82% of the suppliers consider corruption in public sector procurement to be a major or moderate problem, in the main, this perception does not generally prevent them from bidding for work. However, 1/3 of respondents have decided not to bid on at least one occasion in the last 12 months due to a concern about possible corruption or misconduct. Now, this is consistent with the findings in the 2016 survey, and it is somewhat of a concern as it goes to the core of the reputation of the public and local government sectors. The highest risk behaviours was considered to be favouritism towards certain suppliers when awarding a contract, and this includes the provision of tender information not being equal or bias in the awarding of a contract. And I also want to touch on briefly what suppliers thought about gifts and benefits. So 3/4 of suppliers think there is a medium to high risk of a supplier being offered a gift or a benefit worth over the $50 threshold to the public sector or local government employees that have a procurement responsibility. And 26% have suspected the public sector employees of accepting gifts or benefits worth over that threshold from suppliers, but only 7% have personally observed this in the last 12 months. So the actual instances are lower than the perception, but still demonstrate that this is occurring. And interestingly, suppliers who have tendered for work in the construction and commercial sectors also reported a significantly higher incidence of suspecting or personally observing this type of activity. So similar to other surveys, we also asked suppliers about their attitudes towards reporting corruption. And a little over 2/3 of suppliers are very likely or likely to report corruption in procurement of a serious nature. For example, something that might constitute a criminal offence. And this again is a significant improvement over 2016 and really encouraging result for this survey. Yet for those who are unlikely to report, there are still barriers in place, and that might be the impact it has on their organisation, or that nothing would happen, or it might have a personal impact on the complainant themselves. So for suppliers, this is where we see the opportunities to tackle these key concerns. And firstly, we want to focus again on raising the issue, so reporting or questioning if it's suspected that tender information is not being equally provided, or if there's suspected favouritism in awarding the contract. Again, we're looking for continual reminders to all parties, both suppliers and within government, about the responsibilities regarding gifts, benefits and hospitality. And lastly, and really importantly, continually raising awareness and confidence around the protections available for those that make a complaint. We don't want to see that to be a barrier in the speak up process. It's really important. I think that covers all the material I wanted to cover off. I'll hand back to Linda, and I hope it was of some use.
Thanks, David. Some really clear opportunities for the public sector, I think, and some interesting and potentially concerning perspectives from some suppliers to government. So I'd like to move on now and introduce our final speaker for today, Kylie Kilgour, Deputy Commissioner at IBAC. Kylie joined IBAC in January 2021 as a Deputy Commissioner and brings extensive experience of the public sector, policing and law reform. In 2019 and 2020, Kylie was the CEO of the Royal Commission into the Management of Police Informants. And prior to that, she worked at the Department of Justice and Community Safety on a wide range of justice reform projects. At IBAC, Kylie's focus is on Victoria Police, and so today Kylie will be speaking to us about the survey results from both Victoria Police and the community. Over to you, Kylie.
Thanks very much, Linda, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. So first of all, I'll speak about the results for the Victoria Police Perceptions of Corruption Survey. So as Karen mentioned, we had just over 1,000 police employees participate in the survey that was conducted in August 2022. The survey was open to sworn police officers, protective service officers and public servants employed at VicPol. And just under 80% identified as a sworn police officer. 21% had worked for Victoria Police for less than 10 years and 47% for more than 20 years. And 55% identified themselves as working in a managerial role. So out of all of the surveys that we undertook in 2022, Victoria Police employees were most likely to report they know what behaviours constitute corruption, with 95% agreeing with this statement. And this was higher than the 90% recorded in 2016. Consistent with the findings from the state and local government contexts, most believe police misconduct is occurring in Victoria, but not necessarily in their workplace. In 2022, 41% agreed that police misconduct is a problem in Victoria, which is higher than in 2016 when it was 35%. However, this is lower compared to the 51% of the broader community who think it's a problem. It's also lower than what is reported in terms of perceptions that public sector corruption is a problem, which is generally around 60%. 15% of police employees think police misconduct is a problem in their workplace. Employees working in regional locations are more likely to believe that police misconduct is a problem in their workplace. Favouritism, drug use and misuse of confidential police information were perceived as the highest risks for police misconduct. These behaviours were partially consistent with the state and local government context covered by David earlier. Approximately 30% of survey respondents said that they have personally observed favouritism or a breach of professional boundaries. So that's things like bullying and harassment, exceeding delegated powers, inappropriate relationships in the workplace, and or sexual harassment in the last 12 months. The majority of Victoria Police employees describe the ethical culture as strong or moderate. However, Victoria Police employees working in the organisation for less than 10 years are more likely to rate the ethical culture as weak. There's consensus that the majority of employees behave ethically, and this creates a sense of a strong ethical culture. But amongst those that rate the ethical culture of the organisation as weak, there's a recurring theme that senior staff set the standards, but don't necessarily adhere to them. Victoria Police employees typically agree that if they personally observe corruption or misconduct, they would definitely report it. This is an improvement on the 2016 result, where 80% of employees agreed. We're now up to 87% of people say they agree with that statement. There are mixed views about whether a report of corruption or misconduct would be taken seriously. Just over half of Victoria Police employees believe a report of corruption or misconduct would definitely or probably be taken seriously. Longer serving police employees, so people with 20 years or more experience, are more likely to believe a report of corruption would definitely be taken seriously. There are mixed views from Victoria Police employees regarding the protections available for those who make a report. While more employees agree in 2022 that there are channels available to report corruption or misconduct, more employees in 2022 also agreed that they would report corruption or misconduct only if they knew their report would be anonymous. 60% were concerned that if they made a report, they would experience personal repercussions other than losing their job. And this compares to only 46% in 2016, so that's quite concerning. So in terms of turning to the opportunities that these findings provide, both to IBAC and Victoria Police around improving corruption risks in Victoria Police, there's a bunch of things that we'll now be working with Victoria Police with respect to. So we will talk to Victoria Police about how do we go about unpacking the differences in perceptions for employees from regional locations and also amongst that employee group with less than 10 years experience. We'll also be making sure that Victoria Police ensure that their people managers know how to appropriately handle complaints. And we'll have a particular focus on ensuring that there's transparency, accountability, and meaningful action is taken when reports are made by people. The survey results point to a couple of areas of corruption risk focus for us. not necessarily surprising to us, but definitely in line with other research that we've got around what are the current corruption risks in Victoria Police. So favouritism will be a big focus, illicit drug use and misuse of confidential police information. And there's also some opportunities for us to work with Victoria Police to enhance the staff training that's being provided around the protections that are available when people want to make a report about corruption or police misconduct, and about having confidence in the speak up process. So next we'll look at the Victorian community perceptions of corruption. So in May 2022, an online survey was undertaken with 3,000 Victorians aged 18 years or over. The survey sample was sourced via an accredited online research panel, and survey quotas were placed on age, gender and location. So we had 52% of the participants were female, 40% were under 40 years of age, 3% identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, 22% were born outside Australia, with 17% speaking a language other than English at home, and 8% identified as LGBTIQ+. 71% of these survey respondents agree that they know what behaviour constitutes corruption, and this has increased compared to 2016 when it was at 65%. Almost 2/3 of Victorians believe corruption is a problem in Victoria, which, as Karen mentioned, is significantly higher compared to 2016 when it was at 42%. Half of Victorians agree police misconduct is a problem in Victoria. And interestingly, people who identify as LGBTIQ+ are significantly more likely to agree that police misconduct is a problem in Victoria. We also asked members of the community to identify whether they consider a range of different behaviours corruption or misconduct. And generally, there was wide agreement about the actions that are corrupt by state and local government employees. However, there was a bit of a tendency to view police behaviours more likely as misconduct rather than defining it as corruption. The two behaviours that were most likely to be rated as definitely corruption related to bribes. So this was both in the state or local government employee context, as well as instances of police accepting bribes. So turning now to the Victorian community views on reporting corruption. So Victorians generally agree with a range of statements that identify reporting corruption is essential to ensure an ethical, fair and democratic society. 76% agree that if they personally observe corruption or misconduct, they would definitely report it. And this is consistent with our results in 2016. However, Victorians who identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander and those aged between 18 and 34 years old are less likely to agree that they would definitely report corruption or misconduct. We also asked community members which agencies they would report corruption or misconduct to, and IBAC was the most commonly identified by just over half of the survey respondents, followed by the Victorian Ombudsman and Victoria Police. There are some concerns among Victorians about the personal impacts of reporting corruption and misconduct. So a little over 1/3 of Victorians believe that meaningful action would result from a report of corruption, which is a significant increase from our 2016 results. However, many Victorians are simply unsure about this. 1 in 3 people agree there would be personal repercussions from reporting corruption. However, pleasingly, this is down from 39% in 2016. More than a quarter of Victorians are confident about being protected from victimisation, which is a significant increase from the 2016 results. So in terms of the actions that IBAC and others can take to respond to the community survey findings, so we feel that there's definitely a need for us and other agencies in this space to tailor information to different demographic groups to address the differences in perceptions that have come out through the survey results. We also need to improve understanding across demographic groups about the differences between misconduct and corruption to assist with improving rates of reporting. We will be providing further information about the protections available when making a complaint, and we'll also be working to enhance the transparency regarding the outcomes from complaints to really try and boost community confidence around making reports to us and what happens to them. So that's it from me. Thank you, Linda.
Thanks, Kylie. Some positive signs there, I think, but still lots to do for both Victoria Police and integrity agencies like IBAC. So now we've come to the Q&A part of the webinar. Thanks to those of you who have submitted a question with their registration, but please continue to submit questions via the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll try to answer as many as possible and keep our responses short. I can't promise that. There will be questions, though, that we unfortunately can't get to, so look out for follow-up responses in the coming weeks. So, Kylie, if I can go to you first, there's a question about, is there a theme or sector of corruption that IBAC will be focused on in the coming years?
Well, that is a really great question. So thank you to whoever gave us that one. There's a lot of themes and sectors that we'll be focusing on in the coming years. And what I'd point people to is we have a strategic plan that is available on our website that points particularly to our key strategic focus areas, which I'll just briefly touch on now. So in the public sector space, and David might want to add to this, high-risk public sector agencies, including major infrastructure projects, will be one of our areas of focus. And undue influence, which includes things like conflicts of interest, is definitely a focus for us. In the police space, there's 3 strategic focus areas that I'll particularly highlight. So we have a strategic focus around what we call high-risk policing, which is often specialist units that have extra powers and abilities to intervene in our lives more than others, as well as regional locations where we get a lot of complaints from members of the community. So we are focusing on both those specialist units as well as those regional hotspots. We'll have a particular focus on excessive use of force, particularly against anyone who might be considered a vulnerable member of the community. So that might be young people, people with mental health issues, people from other vulnerable communities in Victoria. And we also have a focus on police involvement in family violence incidences. So that can be about responses to reports of family violence, as well as police officers who may be perpetrators of family violence, together with a focus on police officers and predatory behaviour. So that, in a nutshell, is our kind of main focus areas. I don't know, David, if you want to say some more about the public sector focus areas.
Indeed, I think it's just it should come as no surprise, but we're looking at any areas where there's significant transfer of public funds to the private sector and around grants management, projects, infrastructure services, and looking at particular industries as well. This is research work that we're doing around major infrastructure projects that's just been completed. And one of our key focuses in the next 6 months will be the water sector as well.
Thank you. If we move on, there's one for Karen. This is a good one. Are perceptions analysed to determine a case of collusion, fraud or corruption?
The short answer is no. So as I mentioned earlier, the data that we collect through the survey is general in nature about overall perceptions of corruption and police misconduct. So we don't ask for any identifying information from participants about particular workplaces or specific instances of collusion, fraud or corruption. And that's not really the purpose of the survey. So what is made clear to participants at the start of the survey is that is the case, and that if they do have a suspected matter or instance of corruption, that they're directed to the appropriate reporting channels to make that report to IBAC.
Thanks, Karen. So one for David now. Did anything surprise you about the perceptions related to government procurement?
No. I will expand on that. I think procurement's often been the driver of many of the investigations that IBAC's conducted in our history. So it's no surprise that it's prevalent as a corruption risk. What I would say, though, that the perceptions are often driven by a void of information. So those that are involved in the process, if they're not aware of how and why a decision's been made, if it's not properly being communicated or explained, so the communications are lacking, then that void is filled by a perception that there's been some sort of improper activity. So I think one of the key findings from this is that those perceptions really do exist, and it really is important for government, both VPS and local government employees that are involved in that process, as I said, to the extent possible, to be as transparent as possible in that decision making.
Fill the vacuum.
That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, David. Another one for Kylie now. What did you glean from your community respondents about why trust in public institutions has been steadily decreasing.
So I think there's a couple of things, observations I'd make about the survey results. So I think they show us that there's definitely an increasing understanding in community about corruption. So I think people just are more live to it as an issue, which is actually really positive in terms of that people care about it and want to do something about it. I think also during 2022, there was a huge increase nationally in the integrity conversation that was happening. And I think it's interesting to think about how the Victorian survey results might reflect that broader conversation that was going on about integrity risk and wanting to do integrity better nationally. And then I think there's also what comes through in the results is that there's really a perception of a lack of transparency from public sector agencies and Victoria Police when it comes to making a report about suspected corruption or misconduct and what happens when someone does make a report. And so I think that's work for everybody to do around how do we really build community confidence about coming forward, speaking up, and how we will transparently give you outcomes and updates on what it is that we're doing with your reports of corruption. The other thing to note as well is just some of the specific demographic results that show that, for particular communities. So, for example, the LGBTQI community, they've got a particular concern around police misconduct at the moment, and that definitely can be linked to some high-profile events that have happened recently between that community and Victoria Police. And so I think that also you can see how just one or two events can really change community confidence around particular agencies dealing with either corruption or police misconduct. And I think also, like we said, we had a number of investigations that were sort of out in the public domain, and that absolutely, I think, will have also played into how the community have responded to some of the questions.
Yeah, it's very difficult to disaggregate some of that context, I think, over time. Very interesting. Thank you. So what have we got now? One for Karen. So in terms of the perceptions of corruption research at IBAC, what's next?
It's a really good question. Thank you to whoever asked that one. So really, we are trying to be as proactive as possible in getting these findings out there into agencies and discussing what it means for agencies. Really coming from the perspective of a prevention approach. So we're out there, particularly David and Kylie are out there quite often talking with departments and public sector agencies about these survey findings and helping to identify what some of those opportunities to address the key themes are. But the surveys are part of a broader program of work that we are doing, which is really looking at how we increase understanding about the corruption and misconduct landscape in Victoria. As I mentioned, or as Linda mentioned at the start, it's as part of our broader corruption prevention strategy. So this is just one of a sort of a suite of, data and reporting improvement projects that we've got underway. With the surveys themselves, though, we do plan to continue to undertake these surveys in the future. This year, we're expanding the surveys to look at perceptions of corruption specifically amongst members of parliament and councillors, which are two cohorts that we haven't engaged with previously in these surveys. So we hope to be able to share those findings later this year, and we'll continue to do these surveys with the 5 groups that we covered today in subsequent years as well. So it's a bit of a watch this space, and you'll hear more from us on this.
Thanks, Karen. Now, we have had a number of other questions come in, which I don't think we're going to have time to answer today, particularly around reporting, but we will, but we will respond to those questions in our wrap up. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and a big thank you again to Karen, David and Kylie, and all the attendees and organisers for your contributions to today's webinar. Just before we wrap up, a couple of last minute comments from me. We will send you through the resources mentioned throughout this session, as well as the slides and recording of today's webinar. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox. Also, to stay updated on the latest publications and information from IBAC, you can subscribe to our newsletter, Insights, or visit our website. We also regularly share updates on social media via Twitter, LinkedIn, and on YouTube, so check those out as well. And we have another upcoming webinar that you might be interested in registering for called Big Projects, Big Risks, Corruption Risks in Major Infrastructure Projects. And that's something David touched on today. This next webinar will be held between 12 and 1 p.m. on Wednesday, 29th of March. So register for that if you get a chance. And finally, as we come to an end today and you exit the Zoom webinar, you will see a link to complete a short feedback survey to help us to plan future events. We really encourage you to take the time to fill out the survey. We take the feedback very seriously, and it would be much appreciated if you could provide us with your thoughts on today's webinar. We look forward to seeing you again in the future at IBAC events. Thank you and bye for now.